if Trump wins, we're in a new world, I think, when it comes to Ukraine support, when it comes to U.S. relations vis-a-vis Russia. And, I think there's no doubt the Kremlin has a strong preference in this election. And we've seen that in the debates, frankly, where Trump has sort of urged an end to the conflict, has expressed, a real concern about escalation. I know there's been a lot of criticism of President Biden and his sort of unwillingness to do certain things vis-a-vis Ukraine in terms of escalation. But, to be clear, he's the kind of right-wing hawk in this election. So I think the Kremlin has a clear preference for Trump winning. And I think what they're hoping for is that if Trump wins, then the U.S. sort of pulls the IV needle out of Ukraine's arms in terms of the military aid that the United States is providing, that there won't be another supplemental $60 billion supplemental spending package. And that means that Ukraine's military will sort of wither on the vine and then is there for the taking for Russia. And I think if Harris wins, I think what the Russians are hoping for is that this will be another administration that really seeks to pivot elsewhere, to focus on China. Harris, in one of her answers, described Iran as one of the most pressing threats. And I think the Russians might hear that and hope that that's the case, and that becomes the animating interest of U.S. foreign policy. And that, support for Ukraine sort of gradually, is probably, I think they would expect it to continue, but hopefully not at the level that it's doing, and that they can continue to sort of wait out a Harris administration and sort of play the long game there. And I think that's how they're kind of thinking post-election.
We hear a lot of warnings from US intelligence agencies about Russian attempts to influence the outcome of this election using disinformation, perhaps. Russia denies those accusations. But is the motivation, if this activity is going on, is it to favor the one candidate over the other?
Well, I think it is. And I think it's pretty clear that in 2016 that's exactly what Russia did in interfering in the U.S. election then. And, they're sort of been long forgotten in lots of, political mud fighting. But, the U.S. intelligence community had a unanimous document that came out in January of 2017 that concluded that Russia interfered in the U.S. elections in favor of Donald Trump. And I think we've sort of memory hold the impact that had. We sort of forget that before the Democratic National Convention, Russia had hacked emails from the Democratic Party, which then prompted the resignation of the head of the DNC, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, created a real infighting between the Bernie Sanders wing of the party and the Hillary Clinton wing of the party. And then, of course, hacked John Podesta's emails, laundered and leaked those emails through WikiLeaks, and that really animated the coverage of the election in October. And so that had a real impact. And then when it came to the disinformation side and Russia really playing an active role in social media, I think we've now sort of developed a degree of societal resilience. We've become somewhat accustomed that social media can be a real cesspool. But in 2016, that really wasn't, thought of. And suddenly there was, tons of accounts that were saying really racist and vile and explosive things, especially about Hillary Clinton. So I think that may have been a moment in time where Russia could have this real strategic impact. And I think it did have an impact on the 2016 elections. 2020, there was an effort by the Russians to do something similar. Of course, 2017 in France with the Macron-Le Pen election, there was an effort they hacked again and then released that content. So I think this is something that the U.S. is quite on guard for, and particularly when it comes to potential cyber hacking of some of the election systems. That's something I think this administration, at least, is very focused on defending against and watching out for when election day comes.
Mr. Trump rails against what he called the Russia hoax. We've seen a lot of stories recently from Bob Woodward's new book about Mr. Trump's links with Putin. Is there a world where this all backfires, where perhaps it becomes where Trump turns his ire back on Russia in response to all of this drip of stuff coming out?
Well, it's a good question, and it's Trump is very hard to predict. On the other hand, he's been very consistent about how he views Russia, how he views Vladimir Putin. Has been very reticent to say anything negative, frankly, about Russia and about Putin. And even when Zelensky was standing next to Zelensky, sort of didn't do that. And it's an oddity. It's something that's been consistent vis-a-vis Trump for even dating well back before he became a political figure. And there's been speculation that a lot of his businesses are really intertwined with Russian money, in particular. If you're in the real estate sector, Russian oligarchs, other things like that. So look, that is it's been a lot of speculation. But the Bob Woodward book, reporting that Trump may have talked with Putin, that he sent Putin COVID tests that were then hard to come by in the beginning of the pandemic. It tracks. It tracks with the kind of consistency of where Trump has been. And so I would be highly skeptical that there's going to be some sort of real course correction in how Trump views Russia and how he sees NATO, frankly, which he's been entirely consistent about in his entire sort of adult public life of being quite skeptical of NATO, going back to a 1980s ad that he did in a New York paper railing against NATO not being a good fit for the United States.
And that question around NATO will feed into the big challenge for the Russia-US relationship, the war in Ukraine. Mr. Trump says there's going to be a quick peace deal. Harris says we will keep supporting Kyiv. What are the conversations, do you think, going on within Russia's military right now about planning for either? What are the options that they're laying out in front of them?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, I think right now the Russian military has been directed to go on the offensive to try to win this war. There's been no revision of any of the maximalist objectives of the Kremlin. If we think back to when the U.S. was fighting over its security assistance to Ukraine, and we sort of stopped providing aid basically from this time last year up until April. That was a great time for if the Russians really wanted to engage in negotiations. Ukraine was weak, the counteroffensive had failed, they were not getting aid, and instead Russia doubled down on its maximalist war aims. So I think right now what the Russian military is hoping is that they're going to break the back of the Ukrainian military. The Russian military itself is suffering tremendous casualties on its current offensive. But I think what they're hoping is that that they will have the advantage when it comes to attrition warfare, and that the willingness of the West to aid Ukraine will decline, not just in the U.S., but when Germany is talking about cutting funding because of its own self-imposed budgetary restraints, because of its constitutional amendment that it can't have a deficit. Other European actors sort of all pointing at each other or pointing at the United States, and there isn't a collective Western way of supporting Ukraine over the long term. It's been very ad hoc, and I think the Russians hope that aid just sort of gradually declines for Ukraine, and their support increases in weapons from North Korea, technology from China, allowing Russia's defense industry to continue to ramp up. Also, drones from Iran, and that sort of gives Russia the preponderance. So I think what they're thinking about is hopefully is really looking at Western support and that declining, and that being, I think, the key X factor. And if it doesn't, then I think Russia's in a real bind, because what are its war aims? How does it meet its maximalist war aims when those look impossible to actually fulfill? You could argue the same for Ukraine, that it's the ability to take back territory is going to be quite tough. But I think from a Russian perspective, how do you meet Putin's goals of taking back Ukraine if the West sort of doubles down in terms of its support? And I think I think that could lead to hopefully some cracks inside of Russian military thinking that this isn't really worth the fight. And, I think we saw some of those last year. This year, things have been going better, and that's not where I think the Russian military's head is at, or where the Kremlin or the general sort of zeitgeist of the war is. It feels like it's heading in their direction, and so that needs to be turned around.
One area in which the West is perhaps more united is in sanctions against Russia, and those look like they'll continue whoever becomes president in January. What's the path for Russia to ease those sanctions or remove them? Or is this a world now where Russia has to turn to BRICS instead of the West?
Yeah, there's, the sanctions tool has been quite interesting. You hear a lot of rhetoric about sanctions have failed, and that sort of depends on what was the goal of sanctions. If the goal of sanctions was to bring Russia's economy to its knees, then yes, they have failed, because Russia's economy is growing under kind of a war Keynesian economy where it's pumping a ton of money into industrial production. We saw something similar in the United States in World War II, for instance. But sanctions have increased costs for Russia. They have really disrupted supply chains, forced Russia to figure out how to get either Western parts and components and technology, which are still accessing, but through different routes, through various front companies, through middlemen, through the mafia, through its intelligence services. But all of that adds cost and makes their supply chains more brittle. And so I think has been impactful and has increased inflation. The one thing that we can say that historically Western sanctions have been quite successful at is really impoverishing an economy over the longer term. If you look at Iran, if you look at Cuba, not necessarily changing a regime's behavior, but making that country poorer. And in this case, Russia has really benefited from China, where maybe Russians aren't buying Russian cars anymore, but they're buying probably better Chinese cars. And so China has sort of backfilled the kind of loss on the consumer side that tends to really impact an economy and impact the support for a regime. That said, I think we have also not gone after the main thing that Russia exports, which is energy, which is particularly oil. There's been a lot of hesitance there on the U.S. side, less so on the European side, in part because U.S. has been very concerned about kind of a shock to global oil prices. We, of course, as we've talked about, have an election in a few weeks. The Biden administration was very concerned about gas prices in the United States and our sort of very sensitive American voters being very sensitive to gas prices. But we'll see after the elections. I think that is a prime target to really go after the Russian energy sector in a much more aggressive way. There was an effort with this oil price cap mechanism to try to keep Russian oil on the global market, but to reduce the amount of money that was going to Russia. That had some impact, I think, initially, but the Russians have found ways around it. And I think one of the things that we see with sanctions is that their bite fades over time, in part because, there's front company, the company that's sanctioned, then creates a front company or two other LLCs that then figure out ways around it. There's a particular issue, I think, on the European side, where Europe has put in place sanctions but doesn't quite have the bureaucracy, frankly, to enforce them. So we are seeing huge spike in exports to the Eurasian Economic Union, Central Asian countries that have frictionless trade with Russia. So you ship something to Kazakhstan, but it's actually going to Russia. And I think we need to see a lot more crackdown on that. Maybe one other point. Is the Chinese support for the Russian defense industry is really intense. It's something that the United States and Europe has called out in statements at the NATO summit here in Washington. U.S. officials have been railing about this whenever they go to Europe. But what do we see Europe prioritizing vis-a-vis its relations with China? Well, EV subsidies. And I'm not saying that's not important, and the EV tariff issue is really important, but China thinks that it's on the right side of Europe's red line there, that it's not providing lethal aid to Russia, just the means to produce lethal systems. And I think Europe needs to get a lot tougher when it comes to Chinese support for Russia's defense industry.
Max, looking back to your time perhaps as a State Department official, does either election outcome, come November the 5th, lead to an improvement in Russia's chilly diplomatic relationship with the US?
Well, I think that would inevitably happen in a Trump administration. I think President Trump would eagerly seek, frankly, meetings with Vladimir Putin. Of course, we remember the Helsinki summit. They also met on the sidelines of then it was the G8 with Vladimir Putin. And so I think there would be an effort to essentially reset relations. And I have to say, this isn't sort of a new pattern with American administrations. Every new American administration has essentially tried to hit the reset button with Russia. Of course, with Hillary Clinton famously doing that as Secretary of State, but George W. Bush looked into Putin's soul. And even the Biden administration met with Putin in June of 2021 and sought a stable and predictable relationship. And I think Trump, despite all the evidence that we should not do that again, would really seek to re-engage with Putin. I think if you have a Harris administration, I think there'll be a lot of continuity with the Biden administration, and I think there would be no reset. There may be an effort to re-engage or to engage Russia over Ukraine about coming to terms over talks. But I think the only way I think Russia, let me sort of back up. I think Russia would have to send the signal that it is open to talks. And then I think the US might be willing to do so. I think it would be very hard for a Harris administration and unlikely for a Harris administration to send that signal first, in part because the new president wants to send strength and immediately coming in and saying, well, we need to talk about this war in Ukraine, I think would send a signal to the Kremlin that we don't really have the stomach to continue this fight and really want to shift gears. So what I would predict there is that Putin would have to make the first move, and then we would see where we are with the war and whether a new Harris administration would be willing to engage. So with Trump, I see engagement. With Harris, I see a policy continuation, and in fact, maybe a little bit more reticent to engage with Putin than perhaps the President Biden, who would feel a little bit more comfortable with how he's perceived in the world.
Fast forward to January 2025, the new president is sworn in. At what point in the foreign policy inbox does Russia sit in relation to the many other challenges that we face right now?
Well, I think this is one of the big questions for a new administration and for President Harris. I think it is clear in Washington. You kind of feel the gravitational force, both from China and from the U.S. military, that it is consumed by China as the quote unquote pacing challenge, and as sort of the main rival to the United States. And so that I don't really see changing. However, you can sort of rack and stack priorities in a number of different ways. And whether the Middle East continues to sort of be very consuming of the current Biden administration in terms of sort of foreign policy engagement, whether there's a real desire to sort of amp up the pressure on Russia, both in terms of energy sanctions, both in terms of military aid to Ukraine, we'll see. I mean, in some ways, it wouldn't take a lot for the U.S. to do a bit more in terms of continuing its support to Ukraine, in terms of going back to Congress, asking for more funding. And so I think we'll see where this sits in the priority list for a Harris administration. I don't expect her to turn her back on Ukraine or NATO. I think that's in some ways a Biden-Harris administration legacy issue. I think there'll be a lot of engagement with Europe and with NATO initially. But in terms of more funding and perhaps adhering to some of the requests from Ukraine when it comes to removing restraints on the use of U.S. weapons, I think we'll see. And that, I don't know if that impacts where this Ukraine falls in the priority, but it's going to be a big question, and it's going to be something every European leader and Russia is going to be looking out for. And I think the same is true with Trump as well, even more so with Trump. Is he going to take a very aggressive negative line towards NATO and a more accommodating line to Putin? And everyone's going to be watching for that.
Ukraine trying to sustain defense spending at a time when it's lost those really productive places, those places where aluminum is produced, and in the Donbass and Donetsk. How conceivable is it that Europe could shoulder that burden? We've seen Germany increasing its funding of Ukraine's defense needs, but could Europe pay for it if the US just says, no more cash?
Well, indeed, I think that probably the most cost-effective thing that the Europeans can do at the moment is, instead of buying very expensive weapons at home, which also take a long time to produce, or paying, over-the-counter costs in a very competitive market. Israel is fighting, other countries are at war, so 155mm shells are in high demand. The costs are very high, so Europe is paying top dollar to get these things on international markets. So maybe a more sensible policy would be to give Ukraine this money, give it to the government, which the government can then use to purchase Ukrainian-made systems from Ukrainian defense manufacturers. the report suggests that the Ukrainian defense industry, which before the war in the days of the Soviet Union was massive, they built all of the old Russian nuclear rockets in those days. They built aircraft engines, helicopters, transport aircraft. So they do have a sophisticated defense industry. But at the moment, it's only working to about a quarter of its capacity because the Ukrainian government doesn't have the money to give orders to the companies. They can't produce for nothing, of course. And so if the Europeans, and to some degree the United States, start helping to develop that defense industry through technology transfer, for example, British Aerospace, Rheinmetall, some European countries have agreed to joint ventures, co-production in Ukraine. It's easier to maintain the weapons damaged in Ukraine rather than bring them all the way back to Germany to be repaired and send them all the way back. So if we can put more of the production there, of course, the factories will have to be underground because Russia will be trying to bombard them. I'm not arguing it's going to be easy, but the Ukrainians can now produce their own long-range drones. They've flown them all the way to Tomsk in Siberia, 2,500 kilometers. They've just unveiled their first long-range ballistic missile. They are good at technology. They're very good at innovation, as we know. So the answer, I think, in the long run, which will get around some of these political problems and these supply bottlenecks, is, as you say, to see about transferring more raw materials, more production capability, more technology transfer, more capital to allow Ukraine to build its own weapons and to use them. In the meantime, yes, though, there is a funding crisis, and you may have noticed that President Zelensky has just announced that he's increasing the war tax, a kind of Ukrainian VAT, from 1.5% to 5% to try to generate more funds at home. Obviously, this is not good news for the average Ukrainian consumer, but it shows the kind of squeeze that they're in at the moment.
Often when we talk about long-range weapons, as you mentioned there, we think about those red lines, so-called, and whether Russia's President Putin could react to those being crossed. Will a Harris or a Trump presidency change the calculus around this, both in how Ukraine might act and how the West would support it?
Well, it's a good question, and we don't know. Nobody knows, to be frank, because there is clearly a big debate going on within the US administration, and it's been going on for several months already, between, on the one hand, the State Department. I'm obviously simplifying a little bit, but nonetheless, the State Department, which is in favor of allowing Ukraine to use the US ATACMS and JASOMS long-range systems, authorised the UK to use the Storm Shadow missiles too, arguing that Putin is always huffing and puffing and trying to intimidate us with all of these nuclear threats. But every time we've crossed the red line with tanks, you remember, with long-range artillery, with F-16s, Putin has done nothing and backed down. But there are serious people in the Pentagon and in the National Security Council who argue that no, we can't assume that Putin's red lines will always turn out to be pink lines or no lines at all, and he won't react. There may come a point where a nuclear superpower says enough is enough is enough. We know that Putin has an appetite for taking risk, and we could get dragged into a conflict. And frankly, the Biden administration has not been able to resolve that issue in 6 months. So I'm not quite certain, Stuart, that it's going to resolve the issue going forward. That paralysis may last for a long, long time because the arguments are so finely balanced. Therefore, that's why I come back to my answer to your previous question, that from the Ukrainian point of view, the only way around this is to do the job themselves. Now, they've demonstrated with their drones in particular that they have a great capacity to blow up Russian ammunition dumps, Russian airfields, fuel depots. I mean, there have been some enormous explosions in ammunition depots over the last couple of weeks. So their intelligence in knowing where these places are, the production facilities, is very good. And they, of course, are willing to take the risk themselves to use these long-range systems. So that's probably the only way, ultimately, that we're going to resolve this particular dilemma.
The US election is looming, some calling it the most consequential in decades. We've seen President Zelensky of Ukraine meeting both candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, in the last few weeks. Just how important is the result of the US election to Ukraine?
Well, the United States so far has been supplying about 50% of all of the aid to Ukraine, not as much as Trump often claims. He sometimes tries to give his people the impression that the US is doing it all by itself, which of course is not true. The UK, France, Germany, Italy, the countries in Europe that President Zelensky is visiting yesterday, have been doing quite a bit as well. And the EU, in fact, globally supplies more aid to Ukraine when it comes to financial support, humanitarian assistance, reconstruction aid, and all of that. But when it comes to weapons, yes, the US contribution is absolutely fundamental, both in terms of missiles, ammunition, air defense, and all of that. And if Trump cut that severely, then of course the Ukrainians would be in trouble. The problem for Zelensky is that Ukraine is already in trouble, frankly, with the Russians advancing in the Donetsk area, capturing more villages and towns. The Ukrainian army is under-equipped and under-resourced at the moment, and therefore Ukraine is even more dependent upon those US and European supplies at the moment than it was at the beginning of the conflict, when it could still rely upon the stocks that it had built up. Now, Zelensky knows very well that the answer is to ramp up more domestic production of weapons in Ukraine, and Ukraine has got a good defense industry. It produces, for example, over 1 million drones a year. But of course, it's going to take time to switch from reliance upon US supplies to domestic production. So it would be a big blow. On the other hand, final comment is that, as you know, recently Congress did finally vote this package of $61 billion of military assistance for Kiev. On his last visit to the United States, Zelensky got a further $8 billion of that. So providing Trump doesn't cut what has been previously agreed, it will keep Ukraine going for a few months into an eventual Trump administration, if that's what happens, before Zelensky would be looking to Trump and Congress to approve another big package like the previous $61 billion.
We saw Zelensky's charm offensive in Washington and New York a couple of weeks ago. What else do you think is going on, perhaps behind the scenes, beyond that domestic weapons increase, producing more weapons domestically, as the Ukrainians ready themselves for either outcome?
Well, I think, first of all, here in Brussels, at the heart of the EU, there is obviously a kind of contingency plan as a Trump presidency, if not probable yet, at least is beyond the possible, to obviously try to shift more of the burden onto the shoulders of the Europeans. I mean, people are mindful, for example, that even under a Harris administration, there might not be quite the same level of support for Ukraine as there was under Biden. Obviously, Harris has less of a track record in terms of NATO and European security. The other thing is Congress, that even under a Biden administration, as we were just discussing, Congress dragged its feet for 6 months in approving the new aid package. Even if, for example, Harris won, you could have the Republicans winning the Senate, the Republicans keeping control of the House. So it would be difficult even for a Democrat president to push through large amounts of aid. The US scene is, of course, very uncertain. It's not just the White House. We have to look at Congress as well. So here in Brussels, there is a sense that, yes, the Europeans have got to do more. Many European countries, look, let's take the Czech Republic as an example, have been forming consortia to try to sort of pool money to bulk buy 155mm ammunition. 500,000 rounds have been procured this year. That's working. You know, you've got consortia in Europe of the Dutch, the Danes, the Norwegians, the Belgians providing the F-16 jets. American jets, but provided by Europeans doing the training, and you've got the EU pooling 8+ billion euros on a so-called European peace facility, which is also arming Ukraine and again taking care of a lot of the training. So I'm not pretending for 1 minute that we Europeans will be able to completely take over from the American assistance, but at least there is a sense that, you know, whatever the scenario, the US is likely to be doing less in future, and if it's a really fundamental security interest for Europe as well as the United States that Ukraine remains a free state, then obviously more of the burden progressively is going to fall on this side of the Atlantic.
Beyond Europe and the US, there was some talk back when we saw the Kursk offensive begin, that this was maybe grabbing territory for use in any negotiation later, where you may be swapping territory if you were pushed into that. What's your sense as to the discussions going on around this in Kyiv?
Well, I think in Kiev, particularly in Ukrainian military circles, there's a lot of doubt about the wisdom of the Kursk offensive, opening that salient. At the time, of course, it was a morale booster for the Ukrainians. They wanted to show the West, particularly the US, ahead of Zelensky's visit to Washington and the UN, that they were able to take the fight to the Russians. They were still able to innovate. They could do daring things and put the Russians on the defensive. So from that point of view, it worked. But of course, the problems were also pretty evident from the beginning, which is that it would take Ukraine a large number of soldiers and weaponry, tanks, armored vehicles, anti-missile systems to hold the Kursk salient. And of course, if the Russians continue to advance, as they have done in Donetsk, particularly towards important junctions like for example, Volodar, which they've captured, Toretsk, which they are now occupying, then Ukraine would severely miss those troops being far away in Russia when they really needed them for defense, particularly as Zelensky, for that incursion into Russia, used some of his best troops. That's the first thing. The second thing is Russia is a vast country. In 1812, unlike Hitler, Napoleon got all of the way to Moscow, burned the city down, but still lost. So it's very difficult to sort of harm Russia by grabbing a part of its territory, particularly if what you grab is less than 1/3 of 1% of such an enormous country. So the Russians, in many ways, can absorb this kind of thing, wait until they can take it back, and not be affected in terms of what they're doing elsewhere. I think it would be good for Zelensky to have this territory as a bargaining chip when eventually negotiations begin, and he can cash that in for a larger Russian withdrawal from obviously the Donbass and the Donetsk. But the problem is that it's not much use occupying that territory until you get to the peace negotiation. And in the meantime, the cost of holding it, as I've said, in terms of the opportunity costs for what Russia is able to do in advancing against Ukraine, those costs are very, very high and difficult for Ukraine to sustain.
These red lines, these pink lines, Ukraine's victory plan, as we often call it, this will all have come up when President Zelensky met with Mark Rutte, the new NATO Secretary General, in London on Thursday. How do you think NATO as an alliance will be preparing for a new US president?
Well, NATO lived through Trump before. I was still at NATO in my last position there when Trump was president. And yes, it was a rocky time. Let's not pretend otherwise. Trump clearly wasn't as engaged in multilateral diplomacy or in NATO. He didn't have the same background as many other US presidents. He came to NATO meetings and never looked particularly comfortable. And he did, of course, but always bang the table about Europeans not spending enough money. But in that respect, he was right, because many Europeans, frankly, were not spending the 2% of GDP on defence. The UK was, so it was in a good position, but it was in a very small minority. But today, things look a lot better. As I mentioned, the Europeans are stepping up. You read the papers every day about, more big contracts to defence companies, ramping up war production and stocks, buying new equipment, NATO exercises taking place all over Europe, NATO countries deploying forces to Central Europe. It's a very different story, and 23 of those NATO allies, admittedly not all of the 32, but 23, are now meeting that 2% target. I mentioned that Europe is now doing its bit for Ukraine. Europe is supplying weapons to Israel as well, not just the UK, but France, Germany, many others. And that's a cause that the United States definitely supports. The Europeans have been showing up in the Indo-Pacific, including the UK, sending its aircraft carrier there. So if I were the NATO Secretary General today going to Washington, I would feel that, I've got a better deck of cards, Stuart, quite frankly, a better set of arguments to present to Trump, saying, yeah, Mr. President, you were right, because Trump likes to be flattered. We've heeded what you said. We've taken you seriously. We're stepping up to the plate. We're being good allies. And there was some evidence, Stuart, from my last period at NATO, that kind of argument does get through to Trump. But of course, we don't know. I mean, mean, what helped us last time round was the fact that there were many Republicans in Congress who were pro-NATO, internationalist, didn't want to tear up NATO. Will they still be there after the elections? I mean, if we have a Congress of, frankly, Marjorie Taylor Greene types, then it's not going to be very easy. That's true. So we have to wait and see how that works out. Secondly, Trump appointed, national security advisors, secretaries of defense, secretaries of state, who were much more middle of the road internationalists than he was. Will he do the same again? What would be the shape of the administration? So I wouldn't sort of tear my hair out in complete horror in advance. We'll have to wait and see. I mean, Trump certainly doesn't want to be the US president who gave up the US superpower status, who ruined all of America's alliances, who left the door open for Russia and China. And I think what might help NATO this time round, Stuart, if I may be offered just a last comment answering this question, is that Russia and China are coming closer together. Iran, Russia and China are coming closer together. So Trump may have wanted perhaps in the past to, give Putin a hearing, very controversial. But as he sees that, Russia is more now in the Chinese camp, more in the Iranian camp, he may sort of sense that, yes, he can't sort of, pick and choose among America's adversaries, who he deals with and who he doesn't, in the same easy ways that he did before. And America is now up against not just one adversary, but a whole series who are working together. And he really does need allies in order to be able to see America's way through that. So, there are rational arguments. We just have to hope that Trump is prepared to listen. But obviously, there's going to be a lot of diplomacy coming out of Europe to at least try to get those arguments across.
You mentioned 23 countries now spending enough, hitting that 2% of GDP. Mr. Rutte, one of the first things he said is that needs to go up. 2% isn't enough, even though he's from the Netherlands, a country that we often think of as being a more frugal kind of international partner. Is this just accepting that even a Harris presidency will demand an increase in defense spending, and that defending NATO is getting more expensive?
Yes, I think is the simple answer. I mean, I give long answers. I could probably get away with a very short one there, which you'd be grateful for, of course, and say yes. No, absolutely, because clearly, the lesson of the last few years is that the more you give to Ukraine, the more you leave yourself vulnerable. Your own stocks are pretty empty. That's the case with the UK Army now, in many respects as well. Those F-16s, those artillery tubes, those Patriot air defense batteries have to be replaced. So you have to spend twice, if you like, once for Ukraine and once for yourself. And of course, defense equipment is always well ahead of inflation when it comes to price increases and all of the rest. I think one of the challenges for Mark Rutte is not just making the case for more defense spending, but coming up with plans to sort of show that NATO can produce the stuff at cost, on target, on time. None of these 10-year overruns at 4 times the price that we're so used to with defence equipment, and keep the trust of the voters that this extra money is at least being spent efficiently. But it's not going to be easy because, yes, I mean, you've still got, 9 allies who have not met this 2% target. And in the case of Canada or some other countries, it's going to take them a few years yet to get there. Whereas you've got in Eastern Europe, countries like Poland racing ahead above 4%, or the Baltic states at 2.5%. So I think you're still, whether you like it or not, Stuart, going to get a bit of a dichotomy between the countries in Central and Eastern Europe who feel the Russian threat very directly and who will have the political consensus to spend a large amount, and Western Europe, where I think perhaps threat perceptions will be less strong. Maybe not so much the UK, but continental Europe, and making that case, particularly at a time of economic difficulty, is going to be much harder. And keeping to 2% will be probably as much as we can expect from them, like Germany, for instance, under a lot of budgetary pressure, rather than to go to 3 or 4. If NATO does manage to go to something like 3, I think many allies will make it an aspirational target rather than a legally binding target. Yes, we recognise that we have to go in this direction. We'll do our level best, but don't, sort of hold us to it if, other circumstances come in instead. But I think the urgent task is getting the 9 that are still behind 2%, but have promised to get there, to keep their promises to get there in a reasonable time frame.
So while we're talking about formal and informal requirements of NATO membership, What would happen if the US just pulled out of NATO, whether by invoking the treaty or perhaps by just saying we're not going to keep up our Article 5 requirements commitment?
Well, it would be a calamity, frankly, because as somebody who was at NATO for 38 years, it does depend on what America does and doesn't do. I've lived, Stuart, through so many NATO crises. When the Americans came in, everything worked all of a sudden. They provided, I remember Kosovo in 1999 when I was the NATO spokesman, they provided all of the aircraft that could fly at night, all of the targeting information, all of the precision strike weapons, the search and rescue operation. You know, you suddenly realize that American infrastructure, that system of commands, intelligence, that system of bases and training grounds in Europe is really, if you like, the backbone, the skeleton that makes NATO function. And of course, you know, the United States has the Supreme Allied Command of Europe at the moment, and therefore the responsibility not just for planning what its own forces do, but for also planning for what the European forces do, who are all trained to fight under an American command, albeit a NATO command, in wartime. They provide the nuclear deterrence, although the UK and to some extent France have useful additional roles there. So it's very difficult for me, quite frankly, to imagine a United States without NATO. I could imagine a NATO maybe without one particular country or another particular country. It would be a blow to prestige, but NATO will survive. But the United States and NATO are more or less the same thing. Frankly, if you once you sort of look at, as I said, at the nitty-gritty of the day-to-day military planning and preparations, and I think as far as Putin or China or any other adversary is concerned, a NATO without the United States would lose most of its credibility and would be a NATO that would be challengeable and therefore challenged. Whether, you know, the French would be successful at coming forward with the argument they've made for years that this is the time for the hour of Europe and for Europe to stand on its own feet and you know, integrate its forces. Remember, we had the idea of a European army back in the 1950s, although it never quite happened. We will see, and I think the Europeans will certainly make an effort, but it's basically the confidence in the United States that pulls NATO together, and I doubt that the Europeans would have sufficient confidence in each other to try to create a sort of European-only NATO. So God forbid that it would happen, and let's pray that it doesn't.
Do you think this US election matters more than most?
Yes, because the only power that can intervene and try to turn a crisis into an opportunity, be it in other parts of the world, but specifically so in the Middle East, is the United States. I personally, as ambassador to the US and a peace negotiator with Syria, could see firsthand what the Bush administration with Mr. Baker, Secretary of State, and the Clinton administration with the President, Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor could do, and what role they played. And I cannot think of a more important time. There was the Gaza war, the war in Lebanon, the prospect of a full-fledged Iranian-Israeli war that could become a full Middle Eastern war with implications for world security, oil supply, the nuclear issue at stake as well is a huge issue. And therefore an effective US administration determined to invest in turning crisis into opportunity and capable of doing that is of course very, very essential.
Who do you think privately Benjamin Netanyahu will hope to see in the White House after this election?
Netanyahu makes no secret of his preference for Mr. Trump. They ended on a bad note because Netanyahu, after a while, did congratulate President Biden on his election, and Trump was very cross at him and spoke ill of him. But possibly 4 years later, this has been forgotten. And I think he feels much more comfortable with Mr. Trump than with Ms. Harris. and I don't think he even cares to make a secret of it. And he is obviously on bad terms with President Biden. President Biden is quoted by Bob Woodward, speaks ill of him. They spoke yesterday, pretty much after Prime Minister Netanyahu pressured him to have this conversation. He grounded his Minister of Defense, stopped him from going to Washington to coordinate the Israeli response to the Iranian missile attack on Israel, because he wanted the president to speak to him. That happened for about half an hour. We still don't know what exactly took place in the conversation, but I think this is probably a relationship that cannot be fixed, but both sides realize that for the next few months they have to live with one another.
And can you just expand on why Netanyahu prefers Trump? I know in his first term, for example, he moved the US embassy to Jerusalem, but are there other reasons why Netanyahu would prefer to see Trump win?
Not just move the embassy to Jerusalem, also recognize the Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, close down the PLO office in Washington, stop military assistance to the Palestinians. He was very, very, very clear on that. But I would say his support for Israel was not tested by a major crisis. Remember that we have Russia in Syria, we have Iran. There could be serious crises in which U.S. support for and cooperation with Israel could be tested. I would say that if you look at the crisis of October 7, President Biden's support for Israel was actually exemplary in terms of the support, the threats or the warnings to Iran and Hezbollah, the dispatching of naval forces to the region, and his own visit to Israel. So I don't think one could ask for more. But you know, I should say openly, I'm not a supporter of Prime Minister Netanyahu. I cannot find a good explanation for everything that he does, but for his own reasons, good or not, he seems to prefer Trump to Ms. Harris.
And President Biden has said recently that he's unsure whether Netanyahu is holding off on agreeing a ceasefire deal in Gaza in order to influence the US presidential election in some way. Do you believe Netanyahu is trying to sway the US election?
I'm not sure that this is the case. I hope it is not, because I cannot think of something more foolish to do than for an Israeli prime minister to actually intervene in American politics. It happened over several decades. It happened once. Uncareful Israeli president who seemed to support Jimmy Carter at the time, but normally in such an intimate, important relationship, both parties need to know how to work with one another and try to keep away from meddling in each other's politics.
And then on how the Israeli government would view Kamala Harris, I mean, I understand what you say about the breakdown in relations between Biden and Netanyahu, even though Joe Biden throughout his career has been a really strong ally of Israel. Is there a sense that Kamala Harris is slightly less naturally supportive of Israel? And does that make Israelis wary?
Yeah, I'd like to draw a distinction between supporting Israel and supporting Netanyahu. I think that there were indications that she's not supportive of Netanyahu, and most important, when he gave his speech in Congress, she was not there. And there were a couple of comments that she made that indicated that she's not enthusiastic about Netanyahu, which she probably picked up. So it could be a sort of a relationship in which both sides indicate to one another they are not great mutual admirers, and in a way a self-fulfilling prophecy.
If it were Donald Trump back in the White House, do you think he would have, because of maybe a better relationship with Netanyahu, do you think he would have more influence over Israeli policy when it comes to Gaza and when it comes to Lebanon?
Given his temper and his call it decision-making pattern, I don't know what to expect. He could decide that enough is enough, that this war and crisis need to come to an end, and just try to force it. He could do that. I remember when he was president, remember his own Secretary of Defense resigned when President Trump told the President Erdogan of Turkey, "Oh, if you want Syria, you can have it." Not your standard foreign policy making led to the resignation of the Secretary of Defense. You remember how many national security advisors came and went. So, and all kind of peculiar episodes. He's meeting in Helsinki with President Putin, with only a Russian translator in the room, not a second American present in the room. Who knows what went on in that meeting? All kind of peculiar episodes. So I don't know what one can expect in terms of foreign policy in general. If I were a Ukrainian, I would worry. If I were a NATO member, I would worry. And as an Israeli, I would worry.
And just finally, what do you think ordinary Israelis feel about the US election? I appreciate they will have different views, but is there a consensus as to who most Israelis would like to see in the White House?
Ordinary Israelis, are not deep thinkers about foreign policy. We're impressed by the gestures made by Trump at the time. They probably think that he's very friendly. And there may be a slight preference for him, but ordinary Israelis don't make the difference. It's the government and the elite who make the difference.
We often hear spokespeople for China's foreign ministry saying the American election, it's just a domestic affair. Nothing to do with them, but they want better US-China ties. What's your sense of how Beijing is looking at the two potential outcomes of this election and preparing for either of them?
Well, to start with the standard line offered by the Foreign Affairs spokesperson, I think that seems to be the principle of running Chinese foreign policy. That is non-interference of domestic affairs of another country. And of course, the US presidential election is the domestic politics of United States and American population. So I think in theory, that is what they would like to express. But I think really beneath that very standard line under the surface, I think the Chinese policymakers is as concerned as the rest of the world in terms of where America is heading, both for its very chaotic domestic politics, but also for a lot of uncertainty left on international affairs. And then obviously what we can say so far is there's a largely bipartisan consensus that China is the number one enemy or rivalry against the United States and challenge United States supremacy on the global affairs. So what United States wanted to do, it is to make sure delay China's technology progress and also delay the sense that Beijing is able to challenge that global supremacy status of the United States. So that I think that's the overall aim between the two parties. But I think there's also layers of difference between the Democrat candidate, Kamala Harris, and also the Republican or the former US President, Donald Trump. Now, in terms of Democrats so far, what I've seen in this election, China topic doesn't seem to become an element of discussion among the two presidential candidates, firstly. And I think secondly, if we are going to have the return of Kamala Harris, and we're most likely to see the continuous foreign policy that has been largely pursued by Joe Biden and the Biden administration, that is to say, getting even closer with American alliances, both within the Asia-Pacific region, but also in Europe, to have that sense of coordination in terms of taking the China challenge. I think, on the other hand, what we are going to expect to see from Donald Trump, that seems to be more erratic in terms of respecting the gentleman agreement that Beijing and Washington has in terms of the issue related to Taiwan, but also in terms of the likelihood of return of trade war again. So for Beijing, it is not really good option for either president candidates anyway.
You mentioned Kamala Harris. She talks about China a lot less than Mr. Trump does. But her pick for vice president, Tim Walz, he has long connections with China. He's visited maybe dozens of times. How is his history being seen by Beijing?
Interesting enough, I mean, even though his name come quite a lot on social media, but really among the Chinese strategists that follow American politics very closely, didn't really seem to see much and say much about the vice presidential candidate, because at the end of the day, Tim Walz's knowledge on China is really back to 30 or 40 years ago. It does not really apply for the 21st century China. But I think also largely because the vice president is mostly ceremonial role. So I think Beijing will place more emphasis towards both presidential candidates' diplomatic team rather than by understand the vice president or vice presidential candidates in this case.
You touch on the diplomatic teams behind each president there. Something you've written about is how China's foreign policy has become much more centralized. The President Xi and the Politburo rather than provincial governments and the wider cast that we used to think about. Does that change what's happening right now in terms of preparing for a US election result, even if there's perhaps not a preference between either candidate?
Well, I think that sense of a centralization of policy making through the party, the Communist Party, the ruling party machinery, that change has really taken place back to, I would say, even a decade ago, ever since President Xi came to power. That sense of centralization to letting the party giving the guidance on different aspects of policy making, not just on foreign affairs, but also on economic policy, but also on societal policy as well. That seems to be applied for every single aspect of the Chinese politics these days. So I think it's not just because of the souring, the worsening US-China relations, but I think that's just become now a permanent feature of Chinese elite politics these days. Yeah.
When we think about trade, both Harris and Trump are pretty hawkish about China. Of course, we see a lot of headlines about China's economy recently. We've got Trump and then Biden with tariffs and the containment policy. What can China do, and what is China doing to reduce the risk that things get worse for the economy?
Well, I think what China has done and China will continue to do are two things so far. So the two words beginning with S. The first S is the sense of pursuit of self-reliance. The self-reliance in terms of the technology, that China is able to cope with the total blockage from the United States on the high-end technology, whether it's on semiconductors or on quantum computing. So that sense of pursuit of technology self-reliance has been a very much the priority for Xi Jinping's particularly third term. So that the process already even began well before 2022, before the 20th Party Congress. Now, the second S in here is that greater sense, a wider notion of national security. So that pursuit of national security. I give you an example. In the past, when we're talking about national security, we mostly consider the sense that it's all about intelligence gathering, it's about anti-espionage. But I think these days, when we're talking about national security, and that would also link back to, for example, financial stability, link back to food security, and link back to energy security. So I think that wider notion of security has also really played out quite loudly on Xi Jinping's foreign affairs, but also on domestic economic agenda at the same time. And I think that equally also mirror on what has happened in United States. So we're talking about the sense of national security. That seems to be the concept also been widening within DC as well. Yeah.
You touched on the policy of self-reliance. China's been pushing much harder to rely on its own technologies. The export controls that Trump and then Biden have put on have really, in some ways, damaged China's economy. Do China's diplomats see a route where they can roll back those restrictions, or is this just a friction point that they just have to deal with?
Well, I think this has come to a moment of realization that those restrictions will be in place for quite some time. And I think a very clear conclusion came back to March 2023 during one of the sessions on the National People's Congress, the annual Chinese parliamentary session. And President Xi himself said very clearly that US-led West have never stopped contain China and stop China's technology progress. So that sense of reality check and somehow is ringing very loud and clear among the Chinese senior policy makers. So even if, no matter how hard that diplomats may be trying to persuade the United States or persuade the Western strategy and strategic community, I think the restrictions will always be there because it is essentially about competition. It's about competition between China and the United States, who have the ownership and the monopoly on advanced leading technologies. So this is something that neither side will agree to back down.
As well as the economic impact of those technologies, it's often about a potential conflict. And we see Mr. Trump saying interesting things about making Taiwan perhaps pay for its own defense. Is a conflict over Taiwan something that can be avoided, or is it an inevitable thing coming our way?
Well, then this obviously depends on the differences between the two presidential candidates. I think China's line has always been very clear that peaceful reunification remains on the table, judging from the various party and official literature has been given. But I think on the other hand, the likelihood by having a Trump presidency, and that would actually escalate on the military intervention in Taiwan, across Taiwan Strait. As I said earlier, the thing with Donald Trump is he probably will not respect the gentleman agreement that two countries set up back to 1979, which is neither side would single-handedly begin to start with changing the status quo of Taiwan unilaterally. So that sense of a gentleman agreement and has been in place in the last 50 years or so, and that is an insurance policy for Beijing and Washington on matters related to Taiwan. Then in contrast, if we are going to have a high-risk administration, so what we might expect is perhaps a much lower intensity military coercion from Beijing, as what they have done in recent weeks, but rather less dramatic, less bombastic than compared with Donald Trump.
We see beyond the Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, where again Beijing and Washington have, with the US ally for the Philippines, disagreements and perhaps more assertive actions going on, and other US allies getting together in the neighborhood, AUKUS. This kind of antagonism, does this continue the same under either US president, or is it different under Ms. Harris perhaps?
Well, it's all very similar, but obviously advisors around Trump, and especially the defense advisors around Trump, seems to believe that a war by the South China Sea is quite imminent. So that is a distinction between the two candidates. But I think on the other hand, what really worries Beijing is this linkage, this connection between what happened across Taiwan Strait and also what happened at South China Sea. And I think so far what Beijing is trying to do is trying to present a narrative that to do with the historical claim of the South China Sea. And it did not really offer any clear timeline regarding what Beijing want to do about South China Sea, or neither Beijing has offered any clear timeline regarding Taiwan. So that two elements, the timeline is not there. But I think what really worries most of the Chinese strategists is that there's not really a clear crisis management mechanism between Beijing and Washington in terms of, in case of a military escalation, and what two countries will do, and where is the channel of communication, and whether two sides will be able to take up a phone call. So I think that really, for me, and also for many researchers, it seems to be unclear so far. So what we really do need to have is to have some sense of minimum trust-based mechanism, even though the trust is very thin, but that minimum trust base would be required to let two countries behave like two adults.
So much of when we talk about the containment policy, people say it's about stopping China's rise. Is there a sense inside China that this rivalry is about the future global order? How much is this about the US blocking China from its perhaps becoming a superpower?
Well, I think there's an element of global order that Beijing believe, because of its increasing economic capability and military might, and hence Beijing would deserve certain power status on international stage. I think that's only part of it. Another big element in here it is that Beijing is trying to justify its governance model in terms of by having a state-led economy that is able to improve the living standards of the Chinese population, and hence to have flows of international trade, and hence to have a flow of foreign direct investment is absolutely vital for China's own domestic economy. So it is very hard to separate between foreign affairs and domestic economic management these days. So I think these two elements really got tangled together. On the one hand, we seem really seeing from outside, we seem to see China as being this very ambitious and gigantic global actor that seems to be able to mobilize its economic resources to exert its international influence, its diplomatic influence. So that sense of economic statecraft. But I think on the other hand, we also see from the domestic end that economy is not really doing that well at all. And the economy is now facing a serious structural challenge, but also together with a cyclical challenge, that is to say, the 3 years of COVID restrictions taking tolls on the China's economy. So the two challenges added together, creating a perfect storm for the Chinese economy. And that led into a very terrible international situation, and then also even more worrying domestic situation. So by talking about by being global superpower, that seems to be quite far-fetched.
We talk about this perfect storm. The US-China relationship has been hit by again and again over the last few years. We think about a hot war between the countries as being the stuff of nightmares. Can we be optimistic that things could get better? You mentioned the coordination mechanism, perhaps, setting up something like that. Can we look forward to more peaceful times ahead in this relationship?
Well, of course we could look into some more peaceful time, but this also largely depends on whether both sides would have a sense of willingness to sit down together, to have a really sense of urgency, to have a bit of a crisis management mode. Because so far for me, the sense of urgency has now begun to show with the Biden administration and from Beijing at the same time. So in the last 12 months, there's a sense of minimal stability. But whether this momentum will continue to do so, I think it largely depends on this very consequential US presidential election. So clearly, really from Beijing's end, they're looking for stability, and they're looking for biding its time to recover its economy. But really from US end, it's very hard to say. It's very hard to judge these days, and given we have such a close competition between Harris and Trump these days.
Iran-US relationship, to put it politely, is a tough one. There's decades of enmity there. The leaders of each country talk a lot about the other. Well, what's your sense about what kind of work may be going on inside Iran's leadership to prepare for the two possible outcomes of the US election next month?
Well, you're quite right. The relationship between Tehran and Washington has been fraught for decades, to put it mildly. And certainly there is, after so many decades, I think a lot of misunderstanding about the other. This is an important election that will have consequences for the adversarial relationship. Tehran is, by all accounts, looking at the profiles of each candidates, tracking their statements, and preparing for scenarios. But the U.S. election is also taking place at a time of immense uncertainty and fluctuations across the Middle East. So they're tactically adjusting to changes on the ground as we speak, while also trying to anticipate outcomes, be it a Vice President Harris victory versus a President Trump one.
Do you get the sense that one candidate would be preferred by Tehran over the other?
Well, I think instinctively, President Trump, promises a very big game. It talks up the possibility of a grand bargain or a new deal with the Islamic Republic. At the same time, though, he has made very strong statements in favor of reinforcing sanctions on the Islamic Republic to push them back to the negotiating table. I'm not particularly optimistic that President Trump can deliver a bigger, better, stronger, longer deal with Tehran, really because it's not just in the president's hands. His advisors, many of whom are quite ideological and are looking to contain, if not regime change, the Islamic Republic, might not be supportive of those policies and block that kind of agenda. For Tehran, I think Vice President Harris is a better scenario, but in recent weeks we have seen the vice president shift much more to the right, trying to perhaps pick up votes and appeal to undecided Republican or independent voters, trying to show that she's tough on security. She's made very strong statements with regards to Iran being a very large-scale security threat for the United States, which it is. But at the same time, I would anticipate that she would try to continue President Biden's approach, which has been to find temporary accommodations with the Islamic Republic. The Iranian nuclear program is advancing rapidly, and I imagine that this issue is going to come to a head for international and Western policymakers in 2025.
We saw that warning from US intelligence agencies that Tehran was using cyber attacks and disinformation to what they called stoke discord and undermine confidence in democracy. Iran denied that was what they were doing. Can we see that as part of trying to influence this election, or is this just a standard behavior for a country that perhaps has an anti-Western element within its foreign policy?
I think it's more part of Iran's broader strategy. It's a revisionist state in the Middle East. It's looking to push back against American and American sort of affiliated countries in the region, like Israel and some of the other American partners. This approach is about looking to pressure the U.S., call for perhaps greater U.S. withdrawal from the Middle East, weaken international multilateral institutions that in the past have tried to constrain Iranian behavior. So I see this as very much part of that broader ring of strategy, supported by a country like Iran, but also Russia and China, for example.
You've written about how Iran is turning towards Russia and China rather than trying to fix up things with the West. How important is the support of those two countries for Iran now?
Well, I think it's important to first recall that when the Iranian Revolution took place and the Islamic Republic came into being, their foreign policy approach more broadly was about articulating a position of independence. But over the past 45 years, Iran hasn't really been able to bridge any of its divides with the United States in particular, or with Western Europe. And this has led Iran, out of necessity, to diversify its relationships and try to develop economic and strategic ties with China and Russia as an effort to push back or balance against the economic sanctions and containment coming from Western states.
We hear one person saying he wants to build bridges. That's Masoud Pezeshkian, Iran's new president. He's described as a moderate and talked about engaging with the West, perhaps getting sanctions reduced. But in Iran, where perhaps power sits away from the president, does he have the ability to improve things with the US?
Look, I'm a big believer that people matter, and certainly who is in office has the influence at a negotiating table, but also at a decision-making table. Masoud Pezeshkian is one of the many influential voices across the Iranian political system. By being elected, he has a certain degree of legitimacy. He has a cabinet that is composed of individuals from across the system. His strategy to manage Iranian politics that are notoriously factional has been to bring the factions together and try to work together. And his approach in reaching out to the West isn't about transforming Iran or resolving the cascade of Iran challenges that the West sees. but rather it's about reducing sanctions. And he is aware that the only way to improve Iran's heavily sanctioned but also deeply corrupt and mismanaged economy is through negotiation with Europe, UK, and the United States above all.
Iran and the United States don't even have diplomatic ties with each other. Does that complicate starting those talks to improve things?
It certainly does. The lack of direct dialogue has made it difficult for policymakers in Washington and Tehran to sit around the table. And without that eye contact, direct contact, you have to work through mediators. Over the past few years, Iran refused to engage in direct dialogue on reviving the Iran nuclear agreement with Washington. This very much prolonged processes where intermediaries would have to shuttle back and forth between rooms in one hotel, for example. But they do have back channels. The Swiss have long played a very important role in communicating and managing relations, and other Gulf countries like Oman and Qatar play important negotiating roles as well. There are many channels open now, but the Iranians just the other day announced that in this climate of uncertainty in the region, with Israel executing a multi-front war, Iran is unwilling to proceed even with indirect dialogue until after the election is over and until the political landscape in Washington is clear. They sort of argue that, policymakers in America complain that they don't know who they're talking to. And now Iran is sort of turning that on its head and saying the same thing about Washington.
So we see that widening war. Many think Israel will again strike Iran before the US election. Many US voters are watching that conflict very closely, especially as Gaza continues and now Lebanon. Would there be a difference between how a Trump or a Harris presidency would approach Iran and the so-called axis of resistance?
Well, both candidates have continued to wholeheartedly support Israel and maintain a robust American commitment to Israel's security. I also think both candidates, however, find the war in Gaza, which is continuing over a year on, the lack of regular flow of humanitarian aid to Palestinians in Gaza deeply troubling. And I think it's a mistake to assume that even a President Trump wouldn't pick up the phone and exchange some harsh words with the Israeli leadership over this issue. But I think both candidates do see Israel's expansion into Lebanon as a unique opportunity to degrade Hezbollah's military capacity, but also perhaps very maybe ambitiously also try to rewrite the balance of power in Lebanon. This is, of course, overly ambitious and a slightly reductive approach, because the Lebanese political landscape is highly factionalized, very complex, and Hezbollah is a deeply destructive actor within the system, but it isn't the only challenging actor within the system. So many analysts that watch the Lebanese landscape don't have a huge amount of optimism that this military campaign is going to produce a political outcome of stability. It's worthwhile also remembering that ordinary people are displaced. 3,000 people have died. And it looks like this war, the Second Front War, is being executed in the same way that the Gaza war was executed, without strategy attached to it. And that has risks for Israel, can see it being drawn into a war of attrition that will, over a longer period of time, result in blowback against Israel itself that is, and we have to acknowledge this, quite isolated in the Middle East today, with its neighbors very frustrated by the continuation of a war campaign rather than thinking about political settlements and perhaps peace processes.
Do you think the various parties in Iran's leadership, the people who contribute to foreign policy, are they willing to make the sort of sacrifices that a negotiation to restore relations and perhaps end the nuclear program? Is that something that is possible even?
I think with the right mix of pressure and incentives, anything is possible. There has to be enough on the table to convince Iran not to end its nuclear program, because that ship has sailed, but to constrain further advancements in its program. And at this point where we are is to prevent Iran from weaponizing its program. So Western policymakers have enough tools in their toolkit to pressure Iran, but also perhaps to tempt Iran back from this brink. The consequences of a weaponized Iranian nuclear program isn't that Iran is necessarily going to use that weapon, but rather we will see a cascade of other countries equally following suit, and that would, of course, destroy yet another sort of principle and post-Cold War effort at preventing the spread of nuclear weapons.
How do future relations between Iran and the US look? From outside Iran, it feels like there's a disconnect between what the public want. We saw the Masa Amini protests and what the leadership want. How do you see things changing in the coming years?
Well, to be honest, unfortunately, things look rather bleak. The problem is that diplomatic ties have been broken not just for a few years or 10 years. They've been broken for decades. And so in both countries, the worldview and the association with the other is very sedimented. And I think it's going to be very hard to unravel that interpretation, those activities, that enmity that is now very much baked into both systems. I think what can be achieved are marginal sort of time-limited agreements that can, if maintained, build trust, a bit more accountability, and protect both sides' security interests. But it requires deterrence, dedication, and diplomacy to get there.
Is it your sense that either US presidential candidate has that determination and that sense of urgency?
Well, it's hard to say, really, because US leaders for quite some time now have been deprioritizing the Middle East and Middle East conflicts. The United States has domestic dynamics that it has to attend to. It has an immigration crisis. It has broader geopolitical challenges. Iran is a subsidiary of some of these challenges. But negotiating with Iran, while maybe an urgent national security priority, is also going to be a hard sell to the American electorate, to the partisan opponents on both sides of the aisles. So you're going to need a leader that isn't going to be afraid to sell it. But I mean, I think 2025 is going to be the year of an Iran crisis. And hopefully there will be a president in the office that will be bold enough to put down America's red lines, but also be able to get to the negotiating table and try to change the dynamics so that we don't cross thresholds with the Islamic Republic.